I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's talk on Russia's game from the end of the Cold War to the election of 2016. I hardly need to underscore why this is relevant and timely. With the House and Senate committees, along with the FBI and a large portion of the world's journalists investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election, Russian connections to the Trump campaign, it's hard to think of anything that could be more timely. I think most Americans are still wrapping their minds around a few astonishing facts. That the theft of the Democratic National Committee and Clinton campaign chair John Podesta's emails was orchestrated by Russia and exploited by the Trump campaign, and two, that a torrent of fake news produced by Russia, according to one scholarly analysis, that led to as many as 225 million views, played a central role in Trump's victory. Add to this Russia's support for right-wing nationalist populist movements, possibly involving the pro-Brexit camp in the UK, definitely supporting Marine Le Pen's presidential campaign in France. Taken all together, and one is forced to wonder what on earth is going on. These events, and I don't think it's overly dramatic to say so, threaten the fundamentals of the West and are the culmination of many, many developments. Most recently, we saw the seizure of Crimea, which violated perhaps the foremost taboo of international relations in the post-World War II period, namely no change of borders by force. There was the deployment of special forces into eastern Ukraine, the protracted support for the criminal Assad regime in Syria, and so on. And we have seen a pattern of intimidation in the Baltic countries, and can think back not very far to the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. All of this is deeply unsettling and forces us to ask, what is Vladimir Putin up to? How far will he go? What are the deeper currents in Russian history and culture that he is responding to, and what instruments do we have to stop him? Well, our speaker today is supremely well suited to provide insight on these and many other related questions. Ambassador Dan Fried is 6 days away from his final day as a U.S. diplomat after a remarkable career of some 40 years. By the standards of our diplomatic corps, Dan's career has been unusually focused on one part of the world and one set of problems, albeit an extraordinary set of problems, namely, how do we create a zone of democracy, peace, and stability in Central and Eastern Europe after the collapse of communism and the Warsaw Pact? And how do we deal with an angry revisionist Russia after its loss in the Cold War? Dan Fried has been working on these issues for decades, starting out early in his career with postings in Leningrad, as it was then called, Belgrade, and Warsaw, and later in a series of high-level positions, including Senior Director for Central and Eastern Europe at the National Security Council staff in the Clinton administration, where he was, I should underscore, one of the architects of NATO enlargement, as ambassador to Poland, as NSC Senior Director for Europe in the George W. Bush administration, and later as Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. I've been very fortunate to work with Dan in both the Clinton and the Obama administrations, and if you allow me a second to tell an anecdote, I actually met Dan, or I should probably say first encountered Dan in Warsaw in July 1994, before I even had begun my own career in government. He was accompanying President Clinton there on a trip, and it was breakfast, I believe, at the Hilton Hotel in Warsaw. And I was being interviewed by then National Security Advisor Tony Lake for a job as a speechwriter for the president. And Dan and his very distinguished colleague Alexander Vershbow were essentially buzzing around the table the entire time I was, I think, having an interview, with myriad questions that required instant answers from Tony Lake. And it was, without a doubt, the worst interview I've ever had. Every time I answered one of Tony Lake's questions, he told me in no uncertain terms that I was completely wrong and a fool to believe what I had said. I walked away certain that I had failed the test and was completely happy to go on being a foreign journalist and not working with supremely intense people who buzz around breakfast tables. Well, a note to students here, suspend your judgment after job interviews. I got the position, and soon to my great surprise was working with Dan Fried, which turned out to be a stroke of incredible luck for me. And the reason is that I got to work on some really remarkable issues, above all NATO enlargement, and I did so with someone who was thinking and shaping policy in a way that was really extraordinary. Although there are a lot of critics of this policy today, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it later, wherever you come down on the issue, I think we need to agree that enlargement provided a measure of historical redress for those who had been citizens of captain nations for decades, and because it also created hope for a Europe unified and free in a way that had not existed before. It was a landmark accomplishment. Well, working with Dan Fried was a formative experience for me because Dan Fried can articulate as few others can the connection between the big ideas and the values that animate our foreign policy and the concrete steps needed to make those ideas come to life and the ways in which we honor those values. It's a really unusual gift, and I was fortunate, really fortunate, to work with many of the great policymakers of the last quarter century, and among them, Dan is in a very, very small number who can move from the realm of ideas to the realm of policy with such ease. I'm also delighted Dan is here today because he represents so much that is really great in our foreign policy tradition. He has himself described that tradition in his farewell remarks, which went viral on the web about 6 weeks ago, and I encourage you to read them. But I want to point out two other facts as well. One is that he has served presidents of both parties with every ounce he had to give them, displaying the very best that a professional diplomatic corps has to offer. And he has been willing to take on some of the most thankless tasks imaginable. I will tell you that in the Clinton State Department, we all wondered what indescribable sins Dan had committed in a previous life to be made the person responsible for depopulating Guantanamo, which required finding countries that would agree to accept one or two inmates at a time, meet our strictures for supervision, and undertake to meet all kinds of other really odious requirements. It was an awful, hugely labor-intensive job, and I think the department lived up to all the best traditions by giving Dan virtually no staff to get it done with. And he took it on with extraordinary determination and almost incomprehensible cheer. And for all those reasons, and because of his insights and his understanding, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dan Fried here today.
I was going to say to Dan, don't complain about that breakfast in Warsaw. You got the job, man. You got the job. So, Russia's game. Wouldn't it be nice if we got along with Russia? Donald J. Trump, July 27, 2016. Well, yes, it would. And 3 administrations tried. 3 administrations failed. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that they tried to do, and how is it that they failed? Before we turn to the 4th administration, the Trump administration, and try to decide what it is trying to do and whether it will succeed. But the hint, if 3 presidents as different as Clinton, Bush, and Obama all tried and all failed to reach some higher level of relations with Russia, perhaps the fault was not ours. Perhaps the answer lies elsewhere. But let's look at the 3 administrations. The 1990s were an optimistic decade, and we looked at the fall of the USSR in 1991 as liberation from communism. Russia would be liberated from this awful ideology that had done so much damage to Russia first and foremost, as well as its neighbors and to Europe and to the world. We saw Gorbachev as a reformer and Yeltsin on the tank as a kind of apotheosis of the possibility of democracy in Russia. And the Clinton administration leaned forward with the goal of bringing Russia into a common European home. Now, we thought that Russia would enter a period of instability, and then and economic hardship. We expected the J curve, meaning a short period of sharp decline followed by a reversal and a period of economic growth to follow, with political stabilization, the building of new structures, and in that process, the United States and Russia would help build this common European home. This was the pattern that we saw actually take place in Central and Eastern Europe, in Poland, which is smaller than Russia, but not tiny compared to Russia. We were wrong. 1991 was not the restoration of Russia. It was more an imperial collapse, where Russia shrank back to its borders from the mid-17th century. It was traumatic for Russia, and it was a time of state internal collapse, similar to periods of collapse in Russia in the early 17th century and the post-revolution period. So we were wrong. We saw Russia as post-communist, like Eastern Europe. But it was actually post-Soviet, and there is a difference. Because in Poland, a country I know well, in 1989, there was still living memory of a normal European country. People in their late 60s and early 70s, strong and leaders in solidarity, remembered that Poland. And it was that Poland they could bring back. There was no one alive with an adult's memory, or not much of a child's memory, of Russia before the revolution. So I think we misdiagnosed what was possible. But we tried. Strobe Talbot, Bill Clinton's man on Russia, did lean forward. We made some tough calls, but we made them in a spirit of not in a spirit of vengeance and revanche. We were careful not to treat post-communist, post-Soviet Russia as we treated Weimar Germany, with disdain and contempt. We wanted to bring them in. Could it have been different? Maybe. Yeltsin's health, his bad health, played a role. The political weakness of Russian liberals compared to the political strength of the Polish reformers played a role. So we tried. The failure was not one of vision, but of circumstances. Under these circumstances, George W. Bush came to office, and he also tried to lean forward with Russia. Now, let's leave aside the moment when George Bush looked into Putin's soul in the meeting in Slovenia in June 2001. I was there. I promise you it was not in his talking points, and Condi Rice was as surprised as all the rest of us. But in fact, that aside, Bush's approach to Russia was somewhat more realistic and sober than Clinton's, befitting the circumstances. After 9/11 especially, we looked to work with Russia on a counter-terrorist agenda, arms control. The Bush administration brought Russia into the G8. Bush, as his look into the soul remark suggests, tried to build a personal good relationship with Putin. Remember, we didn't know how Putin was going to end up. We saw him, and I had conversations with Condi Rice about this, as a kind of restorer of the Russian state. If you know Russian history, the comparison we made was to Stolypin, the late Tsarist minister who was both an authoritarian but a modernizer, and someone who was modernizing the Russian economy for the 20th century. Now, okay, we were wrong again. And we were wrong because we did not fully understand what it meant under Russian conditions to be a restorer of the Russian state. It wasn't pretty. And we saw early on Putin starting to dismantle those elements of a democratic Russia which were actually functioning, like independent television networks. He went after them. And by 2003, Bush and Tony Blair were concerned that Putin was not the person they hoped he would be. But Bush gave it another try. So that's two that gave it a try. Now here's something, though, that neither Clinton nor Bush did in pursuit of better relations with Russia. They were not willing to give to Russia the empire that Stalin had conquered in 1945 and that Russia now claims in effect today. Neither Clinton nor Bush were willing to sacrifice the Baltics, nor Poland, nor the rest of Eastern Europe on the altar of relations with Russia. Both presidents supported NATO enlargement. Bush personally made the decision to bring the Baltic states into NATO while he could. And it was, in my opinion, one of George W. Bush's best decisions. 5 million people were saved from Russian revanchism later. We didn't know it at the time, we just suspected this might be the case. Neither was Bush willing to abandon the notion of freedom for other emerging post-Soviet states like Ukraine and Georgia. And when the Orange and Rose revolutions in the mid-2000s took place in both countries, Bush embraced them because they took place just as Bush was turning again to the freedom agenda, basically to retool his administration after the Iraq War was going south. Bush leaned forward on the freedom agenda, and we didn't until later realize what this meant for Vladimir Putin. We thought we were supporting freedom and the expansion of the common European home. Putin thought we were trying to overthrow his rule. He looked at the color revolutions as a precedent for something in Russia. I was accused of being the gray cardinal, that is, the mastermind behind the color revolutions. And I answered Russian TV by saying, well, I wish we were that good. We're not. And this led to Putin's speech at Munich in 2007, which was an explicit, clear articulation of an anti-Western agenda and a declaration that Russia would go it alone in opposition to the West. The next year, we saw Russia start the first of its wars against its neighbor when it attacked Georgia in August 2008. The Bush administrations froze relations with Russia, and this brings us to the Obama administration and the reset. Now, Obama pushed the reset as a tactical device to restart relations with Russia so we could cooperate in those areas where we might have common interests. And here's the reset was colored by what I call the Joe Biden proviso. I mention this because Joe Biden didn't get enough credit for some of the good things he did, and I'm going to give him credit for this. 2 weeks into the Obama administration, Joe Biden goes to the Munich Security Conference, and he, not Hillary Clinton, called for a reset with Russia. And then he qualified it in 2 ways. He said, well, one, we will not give Russia a veto over NATO membership, and two, we will not recognize the Russian conquest of Georgian provinces, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So Biden made it clear that the reset with Russia was not going to be a sellout to Russian interests, but it was going to be a good tactical device. And Obama managed to get something out of the reset. Some arms control, some help in Afghanistan, and Russian abstention on the Security Council resolution on Libya, which authorized the use of force. Now, whatever you think in Libya, this was a high point of the reset. It was not a strategic turn, but it was a modest and productive tactical turn. The turning point for Obama was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2014. Obama, like Bush, like Clinton before him, was seeking better relations with Russia, but was not prepared to sell out the interests of other countries. And there is an irony that Obama, who was forward-leaning toward Russia and skeptical about Georgia and skeptical about Bush's freedom agenda, it's President Obama who got NATO to start sending combat forces into the Baltics and into Poland in response to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And it was Obama who gave me, the sanctions coordinator at State, the mandate to go negotiate the biggest sanctions the United States has imposed against anybody. And those were against Russia. The Bush administration never tried it against Georgia. Obama not only tried it, but succeeded against Putin. So that's 3 up, 3 down, right? 3 administrations try, 3 times it ends in failure. That takes us to 2016 and the Trump campaign. I cannot explain, so don't ask me to try. Well, you can ask anything you want, but I am not able to explain what candidate Donald Trump meant when he spoke of Putin in such consistently laudatory terms. I do understand the basis for at least seeking a common agenda with Russia based around counterterrorism. I don't understand a common agenda based on a defense of sovereignty as the sole prerogative of great powers, to which minor powers have no right. Well, we don't know what will happen, but certainly the honeymoon with Russia, if there was one, seemed to have come to a fast end with Syria. And it was interesting to me to see the language the Trump administration used defending the military strikes on the Syrian air base, which recalled language that Dan Benjamin used to write for the Clinton administration, and language that I worked on with respect to the Bush administration, and that Obama used with respect to Libya. International human rights as a standard to which leaders must be held accountable. Arms control, multilateral treaties banning chemical weapons as standards which must not be violated with impunity. That was certainly different than the Trump campaign. I welcome it as far as it goes. But it suggests that the honeymoon with Russia is not in the offing. We'll see. Now, that's the background of the title of this discussion, called Russia's Game. So what is Russia up to? I've given you the American side, partly because I lived it. And I think it sets up the context. But what is it that Russia wants? What are we dealing with? I didn't study political science. I was a history major, so I think in those terms. Russia's often described as being torn between Westernizers and Slavophiles, between its pro-Western aspirations and its inward-looking sense of itself as a separate civilization. Now, that's a cliche, but I think it's a true cliche. I think Russia has bounced from a Westernizer agenda and an inward-looking agenda since the 18th century. It's made progress historically, approaching Western standards and integration with the West before the Napoleonic Wars and before World War I. And in both cases, it was war that produced a reaction after 1815, and the Russian Revolution, and an inward-looking, then aggressive communist reaction after 1917. The dilemma that Tsar Nicholas I faced after 1815 is that he looked at Western liberalism in the form of the Enlightenment as a threat to Russian rule. He might have said, if he was living in the 21st century, don't talk to me about Enlightenment values that gave us Napoleon. I want autocracy. And he turned Russia away from Europe, or from the notion of European progress, right as the Industrial Revolution is taking off. And this turn required Nicholas I to act as a gendarme to crush every liberal revolution his army could reach, because he wanted to prevent liberalism from infecting Russia. Hence, he crushes Polish revolutionaries in 1830, Hungarian revolutionaries in 1848, and he gets into a fight with the British and French over Crimea. And at the same time, his economic policy is backward-looking, trying to freeze things as they were. The Westerner's dilemma, well, think of Gorbachev. He tries to reform the Soviet Union in the 80s, a system which cannot, in fact, be reformed. He fails, but how could he have done otherwise? Westernizing reform in Russia can bring unintended consequences. Now, I know it's a crude analogy, and I only half believe it, but I'm going to posit that Putin is acting in the tradition of Nicholas I, which a lot of my Russian friends is an unacceptable insult to Nicholas I, who was a man of personal integrity and a committed, principled reactionary, not a thief. I haven't said Putin's a thief, but some of my Russian friends do. Still, I think the analogy is interesting. Nicholas I crushes liberal revolutions around his border to protect autocracy at home. Putin crushes Georgian and attempts to crush Ukrainian pro-Western governments, not just to protect Russia from NATO moving in, because NATO was not an issue for Ukraine in 2014, but to protect Russia from infection from without. Russia combines this with a narrative of grievance, that the West took advantage of Russia, that NATO enlargement meant we were trying to weaken Russia and deprive it of its rightful place in the world. The narrative of grievance has really no basis, in fact, because while we were enlarging NATO, we were also building a NATO-Russia relationship, and we had opened up, in principle, the notion of NATO membership for Russia, in which Russia told us they were not interested. But Russia now has turned into a political spoiler, using propaganda, corrupt funding, and other active measures updated for the cyber age. Its goal is to weaken the West's institutions and discredit Western values, shielding Moscow's despotic system from liberal influence and easing Russian domination of its neighbors. And as I said, the danger of Ukraine's success explains Putin's determination that Ukraine fail. Kyiv is a largely Russian-speaking and Eastern Orthodox city. If Kyiv were capital of a country which were Europeanizing, which was following roughly the reformist path of Poland or Romania, that would, in my judgment, constitute a threat to Russian autocracy, not to Russia, but to Russian autocracy. Kyiv doesn't feel like Warsaw, it feels more Russian, but it is also a city with a free press and elections which are not predetermined. And that's even now, at the beginning of their reforms. I think Putin wants to see Ukrainian reforms fail, the better to have all of Ukraine under his thumb. Another motive for Putin is simple vengeance. He blames the West for the fall of the Soviet Union, which he called the 20th century's greatest catastrophe. Think about that. More of a catastrophe than World War II, more of a catastrophe than the Holocaust, more of a catastrophe than the Russian Revolution. The fall of the Soviet Union to the 20th century's greatest catastrophe. Well, if you believe that, and I believe he does believe that, he may want a second round to humble the West and to create conditions for Russia to recreate itself as a great power. And the only way Russia can do that is by violence and violation of the principles that America has stood for since 1900 of a rules-based world. This is a serious problem. It is not going to be easy to work with the Russians under these circumstances. So what then must we do? For those of you who know Russian culture, что делать, what is to be done, is what Russian reformers start with. So I have do's and don'ts, and I'm going to start with the don'ts. The first don't is don't be impatient. Don't be in a hurry. No one summit, no one visit, no threat or joke or a moment where you see into his soul is going to work. And don't bluster with the Russians. They don't appreciate it. They ignore it. They find it irritating. Don't be in a hurry. And don't be in too much of a hurry to conclude a grand bargain. Grand bargains look really good to sort of amateur Machiavellis. They look good on paper. They don't look very good on the ground. Specifically, what I mean by that is don't sacrifice other countries on the altar of better relations with Russia. Now, this notion occasionally floating around Washington that we will let you, Vladimir Putin, have Ukraine if you will cooperate with us in Syria. Don't go there. They probably won't cooperate in Syria, and Ukraine is not ours to give. But don't believe me. Ask Roosevelt how it worked out for him at Yalta. Now, Roosevelt did not actually give away Eastern Europe to Stalin. Stalin already had it. But Roosevelt did sort of shrug and say, well, the Declaration of on Liberated Europe with a bunch of non-binding weak guarantees, that's paper, and we'll shrug because we need, the grand bargain was, we need you against Japan, and you've already got Poland. And that sounded good enough to convince Roosevelt, and by the end of his life, just weeks later, he had come to regret it. He knew it was a mistake, because you do a grand bargain with a Russian leader, it doesn't have to be Stalin. The consequences are ones you're not going to be comfortable with. So don't look at a grand bargain. If you want a big deal with Russia, then you have to start at the single most important current issue, which is Ukraine. They invaded their neighbor, they need to get out. This isn't a ridiculous demand. They've already agreed to the framework for solving the Ukrainian crisis known as the Minsk Accords. The question is whether we are patient enough and determined enough to mean it and hold Russia to it. Serious improvements with Moscow depend on their backing off from their invasion of their neighboring European country. Okay, here's a third don't. Don't buy into the cliches about Russia. And there are two cliches I have in mind. One is that Russia's history makes it so different that you can't expect it to be democratic. That it is, in a sense, well, that Sam Huntington is right. It is a separate civilization. Give up on them. Miserable autocracy is the best we can expect from them. I don't accept that. For one thing, it writes off the periods when Russia was drawing even with Europe. When Tsar Alexander's army marched into Paris, the Parisians were panicked. They thought the barbarian hordes would level the city. And the Russian army was indistinguishable from its European counterparts. And the Russian officers were socially just like the English and the Prussians and the Austrians. French-speaking gentlemen all. And before 1917, Russia had not only drawn even with Europe, but in areas of culture, music, literature, art, philosophy, dance, and some areas of science, it was a leader of the West. We still benefit from that. No, I don't believe that Russia is doomed to relive its worst history. All the more, then, to hold Russian leaders responsible when they fall short of Russia's potential. A second cliche we should avoid is that Russia's capacity for suffering and sacrifice is so great that we might as well just give up, because there's nothing we can do. And the Russians and some American scholars who have internalized the cliches about Russia will give you this. And it is certainly true that in World War II, Russia's capacity for suffering was enormous. And they did fight the bulk of the German army. That was after the period of alliance with Hitler, but we'll skip past that. The Russian capacity for suffering was great. And in 1812, for better or worse, we all see 1812, the War of 1812, Russia's war against Napoleon through Tolstoy's eyes. And we see that Russian capacity for heroism. But that's not the whole of Russian history. They lost the Crimean War, they lost the Russo-Japanese War, they lost World War I. The Germans beat them. And in fact, I've often had this discussion with the Russians when they tell me that they saved us from Germany in World War II. I say, yes, and you were returning the favor we did you when we saved you from the Kaiser in World War I. You're welcome. I mention that because it's important not to fall into the cliches that Russians trot out to gain momentary psychological advantage in conversations, including diplomatic conversations. Foreign Minister Lavrov is a master of this. It doesn't mean that the Russians are weak, but it means that they're like everybody else. They're not invulnerable. So what are the do's? First, do in periods of difficulty, which I think we're going into, or are into, do try to stabilize the relationship. Do try to keep lines of communication open. For God's sakes, if you meet with Russian ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak, just own up. He's a serious diplomat. We all meet with him, or I used to, and I would again. Keep the lines open. And not only keep them open on the diplomatic side, open them on the military side. You know, during the Cold War, we had pretty decent professional relations, military to military. Keep that open. If you're going into a bad period, work to set up rules of the road. The Russians know how to do this, and they even like it because then they're dealing with us as an equal, which they love. And it's worth it. It's worth doing. So look for areas of stabilization, and beyond that, sure, look for areas of cooperation. There's nothing wrong with it. Sure, try counterterrorist cooperation, but before you get your hopes up, ask John Kerry how that worked out in Syria. But do it. I mean, make the effort, and look for other areas. The fact that Russia is a bad actor on the world stage doesn't mean you can't try to think of better sets of circumstances. But the third do is resist Russian aggression and mean it. Mean it. The Russians are not impressed by words. They are impressed by political determination backed up by resources. The Georgian, so here are two stories. Here's the Georgian War. The Russians moved in, they provoked the Georgian army. The Georgian army fought, advanced for 1 day, fought for 2 days, and its lines broke on the 4th day, and they retreated to Tbilisi. And there was a rumor in the city that the Russians were going to enter. They were 1 day away. The war started on Thursday. By Monday evening, we expected the Russian armor could be there. That's what our ambassador reported to me. They didn't. But one of the reasons they didn't is that, well, the Russians started the war when Georgia's best brigade was fighting with us in Iraq. And the Georgians started it with their worst brigade. And the American military flew the personnel of the 1st Brigade back into the Tbilisi airport. And the Russians said, you can't do this, we cannot guarantee the safety of your planes. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with President Bush's authorization, said, we are flying in, here's when we're flying in, here's what we're flying in with. And we did it. And the Russians turned back their armor. I don't know it was because of that, but it might have been. Obama, in dealing with the Russian attack on Ukraine, put his own political capital into the sanctions. He gave me every negotiator's dream, which is a general mandate and no detailed instructions. It was great. Best instructions I could ask for. But he put his back in it too. He leaned forward with his political capital, and he made it clear to the Russians that we were going to sanction them, and he gave me the authorization to prepare more sanctions, much tougher ones, with the Europeans to have on hold. And we did so on open phone lines, with just enough detail so the Russians knew we were serious and prepared, and not enough detail that they knew exactly what we were doing. I don't know that Obama's determination got the Russians to back off from moving even deeper into Ukraine, but I suspect it did, because the Russians, in their moment of great extravagance in 2014, they were laying the basis for claim not just to two provinces, part of the Donbass in the east, but to about half of the country. And they backed off of that. This is an example by what I mean by mean it. Mean it. Don't bluff. And that also means we need to keep up NATO's deployments in the Baltics and Poland, including US troops. Again, I give Obama credit. He pushed that forward. The Russians need to know we're serious. But then my final do is look past the present difficulties to long-term possibilities. The present period of bad relations is not necessarily dispositive for the entire future. I was in the Foreign Service for 40 years, and I guarantee you, up until 1988, no one, except Lech Wałęsa, the U.S. ambassador to Poland, and me, believed that anything serious was going to happen in Eastern Europe in 1989. And it did. And American experts were arguing about whether the Berlin Wall would ever fall when the discussion was interrupted by the news that the Berlin Wall had fallen. Which means don't straight line current events and think that they're going to last forever. Including bad events. There is the possibility of better relations with the Russians. That day is not today, but don't write it off for the possibility. And when you're keeping your lines open to the Russians, it's also to Russian society. And that includes the liberals and the beleaguered democratic dissidents. There are not very many of them, and they have no power. But Russian history shows that these people have an authority that the Russians care about. The old Soviet saying was, in the Soviet Union, we love poetry. You can tell because we jail our poets. We should take the liberal dissidents seriously because the Russian government does. Enough to harass them, enough sometimes to kill them, enough to poison them. Things may be better. But now this is to the students in the room. That's going to be your job. It's no longer mine. I was in for 40 years. I'm done. Y'all pick it up now. And remember, when I was a student in the early 70s, I was taught we had to accept the world as it was. It was very sad that the line of Yalta existed, but that was reality. That'll teach you. Have faith in your country's, in America's ability to think great things and do great things. But that's up to you, not me. Good luck.
Okay, well, I will we'll kick off with a few quick questions. We have a very informed audience here, so I don't think we'll dilate over trivial matters. You mentioned that you thought that the turning point for Putin was 2007 in Munich. Was that really the fail-safe point, or because many have wondered, was it later? Was it something later with Ukraine? Was it when Obama talked about Russia as a great regional power or something like that? Do you have any more precise sense?
Well, look, I picked the Putin speech at the Munich Security Conference because it was an articulation of a strategy that many of us saw falling into place. Even earlier than that, you could see the hostility building. And before that, you could see the hostility building. And after that, there were all these episodes you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Choosing a speech, choosing a date, it's partly arbitrary, so I won't defend that to the death. But it was useful, and one of the reasons I mention it is because it sort of shocked official Washington, which was not ready for it. Now, those of us who were watching Russia sort of shrugged and said, what did you expect, man?
Right.
But it was, for most of Washington, it was a wake-up call, which is why I mentioned it.
The old rap on Putin used to be that he was all tactics, no strategy, but you don't hear that much anymore.
I never believed it. He has a worldview. He has a view of Russia's place in it. That's a strategic framework. Now, you can fault it, and fault it seriously, buddy, you have to fix your economy or you're going to be nothing but an exporter of gas and oil to the Chinese. Oh, and weapons. They're going to eat you alive. And to do that, you have to fix your relations with the West. But to say that his strategy is wrong doesn't mean he doesn't have one. He has one, it's just not the one we wish it were. That's not a man without a strategy, that's a man with a bad strategy.
Yeah. And one theory that's always put out is that Russia feels, after its history of invasion and the like, that it absolutely has to have a cordon around it, that it has to have a security belt, if you will.
Yeah.
Do you buy it?
That's one of these cliches of Russian history that I wish people would shed. The Russians say it and people believe it. But look, NATO enlargement had the intention and the effect of stabilizing Europe to Russia's west. What threatens Russia from the west? Well, rapacious imperial powers, Napoleon, Hitler. There aren't any. And NATO has helped, NATO solved Russia's German problem. Europe to Russia's west has never been so peaceful in all of Russia's history. So yeah, you're welcome. I don't expect the Russians to thank us, but they ought to. We solved their European problem, and after NATO was enlarged, did the US build up its forces in Europe? No, we drew them down. Did the Germans build up their military? No, they drew it down. So what did the Russians, what are they complaining about? That's, their cordon sanitaire is somebody else's country. And by the way, they invaded Ukraine not because Ukraine wanted a better relationship with NATO, but because it wanted a better relationship with the European Union. So I don't buy it.
But it's fair to say that they view, even if the military dimension of the threat is diminished, that they view the threat of Central and Eastern European countries thriving within the EU and NATO as a threat to their form of government.
That's true. And how much weight should we give Russia's demand that the countries to its west be despotic failures so they can feel better about themselves? So one time in the 90s, I'll tell you a story which illustrates this. Somebody in the Washington foreign policy world was lecturing the Polish ambassador to Washington why he should give up dreams of being in NATO because it would upset the Russians. And Pole said, well, but it's irrational for the Russians to worry for the following reasons, and this is what we can do to assuage their concerns. And he said, yeah, the Russian fears may be irrational, the American said, but you have to give them they're felt in Russia's heart. And the Pole later said to me, why is it that it's my country which has to give up its security in order to assuage the irrationality of Russia? Just, give them a psychiatrist, but don't ask my country to pay the price again. We were friends, so you could say that. But, go tell that to the people that Russia kept in bondage for 2 generations, that they're the ones who get to make the sacrifices for the sake of Russia's dictatorial self-image. Yeah, try that. In fact, as you know, Bill Clinton trotted out to Lech Wałęsa and Václav Havel during his first trip to Europe in January '94, the notion that they didn't need to be in NATO, they could have this partnership for peace alternative, and Bill Clinton came out of that meeting and said, oh man, I need another set of points. This is not going to work with these guys. You can imagine Lech Wałęsa's reaction. It was not good, or Václav Havel's reaction. They didn't appreciate it. And, Clinton, who had, his strategy was rooted in his political field. Nobody better, right?
Right.
He knew that this wasn't going to work, and he's told us to come up with something better. We did, or we tried.
Okay, let's throw it open to the audience. Sir, can you wait for a microphone? I think otherwise your question will be lost to history. Just
good. I was in Ukraine as country director for Peace Corps during the whole period that you're talking about. And I guess the first thing I'd like to say is, I had a seat at the table at the embassy, although I wasn't in a diplomatic role. But I was very proud of our diplomats, our ambassador, and how they managed that situation. And I think I think Americans don't know enough about the State Department and the good work that people do and the values that they represent. So I just wanted to share that. But you spoke about President Obama's the sanctions, but one of the big debates was about whether there should have been military aid. And it seems to me that Putin, is someone you have to stand up to, and giving military aid to Ukraine would have been a stronger message. And I guess my second question is about NATO. I mean, wasn't NATO really created as defense against the Soviet Union? So why shouldn't NATO have perhaps been disbanded after the fall of the Soviet Union, and why wouldn't Putin think of that as a threat specifically to Russia?
Were you there, what years were you in Ukraine? 2014?
2010 to 2014 with John Taft and Jeff Biden both.
Well, they're both aces. They're wonderful ambassadors. Well, two questions, both of which go in opposite directions, right? More military aid to Ukraine, less NATO. But okay, yeah, the Obama administration debated and agonized about increased military assistance to Ukraine and decided against it. I would have come out the other way. I would have rather had sanctions and military support for Ukraine, but okay, I'll take what I get. And the Trump administration may reopen this. We'll see. But the question about NATO, first, NATO was not actually created only to defend against the Soviet Union. The British quip about NATO is that it was designed to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Think about it. NATO was supposed to solve the perpetual problem of European great powers going to war with each other every generation. Like, enough. It was America's way of taking away the keys to the car after your teenage drivers had 2 crashes. Like, enough. It's over. And after the end of the Cold War, we debated NATO's future. But we thought that NATO could be and was a stabilizing instrument for Europe. Remember, Germany was being reunited, right? A bunch of East European countries were recovering their sovereignty for the first time. Didn't you want the West to have a security element? Did you want to freeze NATO enlargement, NATO's membership as it was in 1945? And this was the debate that I was in. I mean, I could go on about it. I think if we had abolished NATO, we would have had to recreate it. You really think that if we had abolished NATO, the Russians would have seen this as a sign of goodwill? You sure about that? You willing to take that chance? Right. NATO is the security instrument of the West. And it has a role in counterterrorism. It played a role in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it has a role still to deal with potential or existing Russian aggression. I mean, I can go on, but you deserve an answer because it's a fair question.
As far as what are your thoughts, you made some pretty good recommendations as far as how to move forward in the relationship with Russia and the importance of maintaining a line of communication with that country. As a diplomat or a future diplomat, how does somebody at the same time negotiate that future objective of creating a healthy relationship and lines of communication when at the same time we have the congressional investigations, the intelligence investigations, FBI, Department of Justice, continuing to do their progress in finding details and the future that could potentially hold and the ramifications in verifying the actual facts and evidence in the meddling that took place in that election. How does somebody like you or a future diplomat negotiate those two opposing truths?
As a general rule in diplomacy and foreign affairs, you have to be able to do two things at the same time and not go crazy. So you have to be able to push back against the Russians in one area and try to work with them in another. Easier said than done, I grant you, but you do it. Now, I thought you were going another way, but your question is a fair one. I'll divide it into two parts, though. One is our response. How should we respond to past and possibly current Russian meddling, including cyber interference? Now, the Obama administration, going out the door, implemented some cyber sanctions against Russia, which I had a hand in. I wasn't the sole author, but I was one of the people designing it. I think that we ought to take a serious look at the Russian cyber sector and go after those elements of the cyber sector which are engaged in illegal or aggressive behavior. That's a whole new area of problems. Okay, I don't want to elaborate, but that's one area. It's a second area. What were the details of Russia's meddling in the 2016 elections? And I'm going to stay away from that, partly because I don't know much more than is in the newspapers. And the impact of that is complicated. I think y'all can figure out what that does to the administration's policy approach. But it doesn't change anything I said about what we should be doing. And I think we have to simply let the domestic process take its course and go where it leads, but also think about the Russia policy separately. But Russia policy will have to include some measure of retaliation for the cyber meddling. Now, this is not just the US, it's also Europe, and right now, the Russians are leaning very hard on the French elections. Marine Le Pen has this right-wing European nationalist affection for Putinism. They see themselves as kind of kindred reactionary spirits. Nicholas I, right? Holy Alliance, autocracy versus the Enlightenment. Okay, so it's 200 years later, and here we are. The Europeans are also worried about this. And if I were in the administration, one of the things I would be doing is talking to the European Union about common efforts on cyber and common efforts to identify and expose Russian propaganda. And there are different ways to do it, but that's a big deal, and I'd be doing it with the European Union, I'd be doing it with key European national governments. So it's a busy agenda. That item, mean it, resist Russian aggression and mean it, that includes the cyber and propaganda fields.
Yes, thank you so much for being here today. This is fascinating. However, I'm a psychologist. I was trained here in the Department of Psychiatry at Dartmouth, and then I worked for years in the Department of Psychiatry in UNC Chapel Hill. So that gives one perspective on the way I see things. Also very intensely involved in travel in Latin America and involved with the Latin American Studies program at Duke and UNC while I was there, and have only recently returned back here. And my position is very contrary to yours.
Okay.
And it's based on all of that experience and orientation. Plus, I've been doing in-depth study of the works of 3 Russian scholars here in this country from Princeton, NYU, Connecticut, and San Francisco. I could give you the names. But I will pose this. about about American hegemony, and my perception of what our position has been in the Western Hemisphere, and particularly about our relationship with Mexico and Cuba, and specifically our invasion of Cuba in the Bay of Pigs, and what our reaction was. And of course, this is quote unquote our sphere of influence, the Western Hemisphere, and reviewing our history in that particular situation of Soviet missiles being planted in Cuba to protect Cuba from another American invasion, and how we reacted. Sometimes I think we don't really understand Russia's point of view in terms of NATO, and particularly I think I've read William J. Perry's book, On the Frontier of the Nuclear, I don't have the exact name of the book, but I know that he was, as Secretary of Defense, he was opposed to the expansion of NATO. And George Kennan, who first of all was the architect of containment, turned to the point of warning against NATO expansion and said it would be a tragedy if we tried to engulf Ukraine. So I would like your response to how our country has reacted in terms of our sphere of influence in Latin America versus what you've been saying about Russia and their sense of being threatened by us and by NATO.
Okay. Well, Bill Perry started out opposed to NATO enlargement, and he ended up supporting it. George Kennan was, and through the end of his life, opposed to NATO enlargement. But as I said earlier, NATO is an instrument of Europe's stability after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And we didn't grab countries and force them into NATO. They wanted to be in NATO. And as the president of Poland said, not Wałęsa, but his successor, we want to be in NATO for the same reason you want to still be in NATO. And I would not want to tell the Poles that they were not entitled to the same security all other Europeans had received. But let me make a point about Russia versus the United States. And I am not going to defend all of America's blunders, mistakes, dumb moves, extravagances in all of our history. From Wilson intervening in Mexico all the way up through the Iraq War. I won't do it, because these were dumb moves. I will say that the free world that America made after 1945 stands up pretty well. The longest period of general peace in the West since Roman times. Democracy, prosperity, for all our blunders, and you and I could discuss the list and we might agree on most of it. I'll stand up for our country's record, but let's discuss the difference in America's approach to the world and Russia's approach to the world by comparing our approach to Mexico before this administration's, which I don't understand, and Russia's approach to Ukraine. After a lot of blundering and bullying, we discovered some time ago that our interests were best served by a successful, prosperous, democratic Mexico. It worked for them, it worked for us. A wealthy, successful, modern Mexico is something that is in our national interests. We'll make a lot of money, the Mexicans will make a lot of money. I'm not talking about the wall, building the wall, any of that nativist stuff about Latino immigration. But in terms of strategy, as a rough point of view, we want to see Mexico successful. Russia and Ukraine. Russia looks at Ukraine as a country they want to see poor and disorganized. A successful Ukraine, a democracy, a prospering country without Russia's system of oligarchy and kleptocracy and massive centralized corruption is a threat to Russia's style of autocratic rule. They want to see Ukraine chaotic. They don't want to run it. They just want to see it under the thumb of a pliable puppet like the former President Yanukovych. Now, I'm oversimplifying. You know more about Mexico than I do. I get that. But as a general rule, this is the difference between America, which believes in a positive-sum world. We think we're going to get rich if the world is a better place, which is both naive and self-serving, but it works out pretty well for the world. Russia believes that it can only be secure if it is surrounded by poor, wretched, weak, and thereby subservient neighbors. And this has been the case since the 18th century. You know, I could give you the example from, Catherine the Great invades Poland in 1795 because she's afraid that the new Polish liberal constitution will make Poland a modern, functioning constitutional monarchy. Can't have that, so they go to war. There's a pattern in Russian history, and that's the difference between us and them. One of them. Anyway, there's much more to say, and I don't, and your litany of American problems and mistakes is, I can't argue with it, but I'll still say we have a better track record.
I heard you speak of the Donbass, but not so much of Crimea.
Right.
And if I think from the perspective of somebody who might have been born in a Russian speaker in the Soviet Union, but woke up suddenly in Ukraine, where not everybody's a Russian speaker, and Ukraine's a country with the same corruption index as Russia has, roughly around 29, but Russia has double the GDP of the Ukraine. So what would one say would be a fair outcome for the Russian-speaking population in the various Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, especially Crimea?
Well, Crimea is somewhat different because there was a far larger actual ethnic Russian population. And the current deal on the table provides for us lifting the sanctions against Russia once the Donbass is restored to Ukraine. But we recognize that as a practical matter, Crimea is going to be in Russian hands for a longer time, and what we've said is we'll reduce our sanctions to only Crimea. But you asked a larger question I have to get into. Being a Russian speaker does not mean being pro-Russian. It's not the same. Yulia Tymoshenko, the Ukrainian patriot nationalist politician, speaks better Russian than Ukrainian. She's not a pro-Russian person. So it's not the same, okay? The English-speaking Canadians fought off the Yankees quite successfully. War of 1812, Revolutionary War, that's the war America lost. We don't talk about that. The deal for the Donbass is going to be some kind of decentralization with rights for the Russian language communities. The Ukrainians know this. They're willing to accept it. But that's not the issue. Putin didn't go to war to protect the Russian speakers. That's nonsense. He went to war to keep all of Ukraine under his thumb. Okay, that's why he did it. The Maidan, in the Maidan, the square in central Ukraine where the pro-democracy, pro-European demonstrators gathered, they were flying the EU flag. They weren't flying the NATO flag, they weren't flying the American flag, they were flying the EU flag because to them it meant Europe, it meant the West. They believed in us, the West, in higher standards, less corruption, more democracy, more rule of law. Now, it's a little hard to say to them, oh, never mind, you're fated to be ruled by Russia. And Ukraine, I mean, corruption. It's, you know, they have a long way to go, okay? To put it mildly. And part of our strategy means keeping one arm around the Ukrainian shoulder and another foot in their back. You know, it's tough love and kicking them. And I'm not, you know, I'll say it. I've said it before. But they deserve their shot. They deserve their shot. Look, it's 100 million Europeans from the Baltic to the Black Sea. With Ukraine, it's 145 million Europeans. That's about the population of Russia, with a higher GDP. So why is it, I ask rhetorically, that the interests of those countries are of no account, but we have to subordinate them to Russia because of Russia's hurt feelings? That doesn't add up to me, to be blunt about it.
What do you think about the president's insistence that many allies, particularly NATO allies, aren't paying their fair share?
Well, he's right. That is, NATO has a standard that countries should be paying up to 2% of their GDP for defense. And the British are doing it, the Poles, the Balts, the Turks, the Greeks, and us. And I think that's it. The Germans should be paying more, so he's right. It's not quite true that they owe us money or that, you know, giving them a bill or something. But subtract the president's style, and he's actually right in terms of substance. And, you know, Bill Gates in the Obama administration said the same thing.
Bob Gates.
Oh, sorry, Bob Gates. Yeah,
Bill
excuse
Gates
me.
has enough money.
Bob Gates. Bill Gates ought to pay the bill himself.
Yeah.
So he's right. Whether you can do that by sort of, you know, what the best tactic is another thing. But the administration's right.
Could you tell me if Putin would consider a lightning war, a kind of a macro Berlin Wall, to establish facts on the ground that it would be too expensive to reverse, given the extent to which he has militarized Kaliningrad and has many so-called snap drills with his forces, and he seems to, I don't really know that much, but he seems to want to maintain his soldiers at a far higher rate of readiness than anything like what we have in the West.
Well, you're right. And there has been, you're right that many people are and probably should be worried about possible Russian aggression. I was in Tallinn a few months ago, and someone at a conference, and somebody asked the Estonian defense minister, and what would your country do if little green men appeared in eastern Estonia? And he said, we would shoot them. But it was partly because of this concern that NATO and separately the US decided to send combat forces to the Baltics and Poland. And the idea is the same as it was during the Cold War about Berlin. You make it impossible for the Russians to conquer these countries without a war. And you put in enough, hopefully enough, that they can actually hold it, but certainly enough that the Russians have to make a fight of it. Now, I wish we weren't there, but the Russians brought this on themselves. And it is, you know, Putin complains without merit that the West is building up, and he creates near him, and now he creates conditions that make us send forces. They are not sufficient forces to attack Russia. They are sufficient barely to defend these countries. But it was the right thing to do. So you are right, you have identified a real problem. And we're going to have to stick with it.
What is the significance, if any, of the recent street demonstrations that have occurred in Russia?
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know where we are on the curve of longevity of the current Russian regime. I don't know. It does feel as if Putinism is entering a kind of decrepit phase. But I don't know. And it is interesting to me that Navalny, the Russian dissident, who has no organization, was able, by mere virtue of doing I think it was a YouTube video about the massive wealth of Prime Minister Medvedev, and then sort of calling for demonstrations on a certain date, he was able to get people out to demonstrate. And that's not the United States. You can demonstrate, nothing happens to you. You don't worry that you're going to lose your job or be arrested. In Russia, you have to. It takes some courage to do that. To me, I'm not willing to say, oh, this shows that Putinism is on the decline or it's going to be overthrown. I'm not saying that, and I don't know that I believe it. But I do believe that this notion of Putin's overwhelming popularity is just mistaken. I have these fights with the pollsters who say, well, we do polling in Russia and Putin is 80% popular. Yeah, come on, man, what planet are you on? If somebody calls me up and I'm a Russian and asks me whether I like Putin, which answer is the healthy answer? What are you going to say? What's the matter with you? You don't have any imagination? God. The popularity tends to be shallow. They're really popular until they're really not. And Putin doesn't act like a confident ruler. And what I hear is that the graft is getting worse.
How would you say doesn't act like a confident ruler?
Because he's so sensitive to anything negative. He jumps on it nervously.
Well, he seems like a stoic compared to our president. Maybe that's not the right standard.
There's a difference between rhetoric and use of state authority. You just said what you said about our president. You're not going to be fired. And you know you're not. And you're not going to go home and worry about, being arrested tonight.
I hope you're right.
American institutions, look, there's a difference. One of the Russian liberal dissidents I know personally has been poisoned the last 2 times he went back to Moscow, Vladimir Kara-Murza. He went back, he was poisoned, almost died, came to the United States, was an invalid, recovered, and he went back. That's courage. And people are willing to do that in Russia, which is why I'm not willing to write them off as all sheep who want a strong czar.
Do you see the current state of U.S.-Russian nuclear capabilities as something that's going to hopefully continue deterring a state of conflict in Eastern Europe? Or do you think it might provide for an escalation of conventional conflict because Russia knows that we don't want to get involved in a nuclear war?
I wish I were able to tell you with surety that Putin was as cautious as Brezhnev. Brezhnev and that generation of Soviet leaders went through World War II. Whatever their many faults, they knew what war was like and they didn't want it again. They also knew that Russia had never seen it so good, from their point of view. Now, it had been in much better shape in 1914, before 1917, but from their point of view, they were aggressive, but they also wanted to preserve the gains of World War II. Putin is more of an adventurer, and that's troubling. Now, I know Brezhnev invaded Afghanistan, I get that. But we probably drew down our forces in Europe too fast and too far. And we're having to reverse that. And it was Obama that did it. Rumsfeld under Bush couldn't draw down the forces fast enough. That's probably a mistake.
Dan, I have one closing question. Our time is coming to an end, and one thing that has struck me during your day here is how much your worldview, and I mean this in a very positive way, was shaped by direct experience of the Cold War and an understanding of what it meant for the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe to be unfree. And I am curious how you feel about the possibility of new generations of diplomats and policymakers who don't share that understanding. It was certainly something that was, I think, very much alive when we were all working on NATO enlargement.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say that most of the diplomats that you and I know, no matter what their age is, know their history. But at the same time, there's no excuse, there's no substitution for that kind of experience. And so I'm curious if you'd want to reflect on that.
All right, so it's a kind of generational fault that we all look at people my age, look at the younger generation and think, oh, they're so shallow, they don't know. The next generation is not going to have the same experience as I did. They're not going to experience firsthand the Cold War, and they're not going to experience the successful aftermath when the East Europeans really did a pretty good job with their liberation. They didn't waste it. But first, hey, this is Dartmouth, man, so beef up the history department. Make them take some courses. But also, and more seriously, you build on the experiences you know. Russia right now is giving you, for example, our theme, Russia's giving you plenty, I'm speaking to the students, it's giving you plenty of material to form your impressions on. RT, the propaganda station, the Russian epistemological relativism, that there's no such thing as truth except power, and what we say is truth. The invasion of Ukraine, the denial that there were little green men there, the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner and then lying about it. Hey, you don't have to go back to the Cold War and read about it. You got plenty of examples right now, this last couple of years, so you can form an impression of what a dictatorship acts like. And that'll have to do. And yeah, but I wasn't kidding. That, I wasn't alive in World War II, but I sort of know what happened. And giving people a historical grounding is a task for high schools and universities and graduate schools. You know, that sense. It's not a satisfactory answer, but it's what
That's
I
the
got.
best one we got, right. Well, on that note, that injunction to learning, an appropriate place to stop here at a university. Let me thank Dan Fried for a tremendous discussion today and for visiting us here this week.
My pleasure.